we're going to experiment with various things within this space. But if you look at strategies for implementing interconnection, strategies for caching content, strategies for managing the links into the home, strategies based on actual packet control, there's a rich set of tools out there. And I actually think we should start by coming at it from an entirely different direction, which is to say, can we create a taxonomy of harms and decide which of them we think are likely to happen and whether any of them have actually happened? Okay? And you know, there is a harm going on right now. I think there's a, you know, the content that is flowing from Netflix is so large a component of the total capacity of the internet. Some, you know, Sandvine says it's 1/3 or something like that. That wherever it goes, congestion follows, right? And it's clear that there are points of congestion in the internet today, and that's producing real consumer frustration. I mean, people have actually called me on the phone and said, okay, Netflix is so bad I can't watch it at night. Now, should I call Netflix and say, unless they do something, I'm going to drop the contract, or should I call Comcast and say, unless you do something, I'm going to yell at you? Who should I yell at? So
I didn't know you'd take calls like that. I'm going to be calling you soon. It's helpful.
I don't think there's a technologist in the room who hasn't at some point been called by a neighbor, parents of some kids, and said, you know how to configure a home router?
It's usually my mom.
It's usually a mom, right? So, you know, I think it might be interesting to say, well, let's start from the other angle instead of saying what's technically possible. I would start by saying, do we understand what the harms are? Because if there are no harms, then what are we mitigating? But let me pass this on to somebody.
Yeah, no, and Valen, I'm glad that David started by talking about BT. You know, one thing we're trying to do more and more in this conference is get off the provincial United States view of the world. And your company obviously represents a very global, international approach to this. So I asked only an American question. I mean, what's your take on the state of net neutrality worldwide, globally, in other countries, not just the United States?
Well, let me preface this by saying that anything I share here is just my personal opinion. It's not a representative of Liberty Global or any corporate view here. Net neutrality started as a concept. It's really a concept and maybe a construct which have taken many different paths. And it's primarily been developed really around the thinking of how do we manage behaviors of the tier 1 providers specifically. So there's no undue discrimination against different services, web services. Well, the tier 1s have shown over the last 15 years that they know how to behave. Secondly, it's really a moot point because even if they choose not to, the balance of power has shifted from the distributor to really the content publisher or creator. And so it's not like, a tier 1 can now really want to discriminate and have a viable commercial enterprise. It's just no longer feasible. But however, the original concept of trying to regulate behavior has now turned into more of how do we regulate commerce, and using net neutrality as maybe an umbrella to manage the tier 1s as to how they can monetize their networks. And the tier 1s, for the most part, have two goals here, really. One, cost recovery. I'm spending a lot of money on this thing. And then two, to have the other conversations with their CFOs, okay, how do I actually monetize this? Forget the monetization. Now everybody's just worried about how do I just cost recover. And it's not so much an issue today, but everybody's looking at all traffic patterns and the changes in the traffic patterns and the nature of the traffic. And you go, wow, in 5 to 10 years, this is going to be a freaking disaster for everybody. Because it used to be, it's mostly just, variable bit rate traffic, very highly traffic engineered, and you build big backbones on it. Half the companies that did that figured out they couldn't monetize it. Most of those backbones were built on transit costs of about maybe $60, $70 a meg. I remember back in 2000, everybody had business cases. Well, it's close to about $1 a meg for transit. So there is no monetization there for that. So the challenge for everybody is, okay, now if the traffic pattern changes from just variable bitrate traffic, emails and sending pictures, and more into constant bitrate traffic, which is video. How do we manage this? Because the traffic engineering patterns that's been used is completely out of the window. But the world has also changed again, and what's more happening now, it's moving from variable bitrate to constant bitrate to adaptive bitrate, which means no matter how much traffic capacity you put on there, you'll just adapt to a higher profile and just eat up that bandwidth. So now you really have a challenge on cost recovery. And so most, I would say if we were investors and we were looking at investing in a tier one, that would be our biggest concern. How do you cost recover? Forget monetization. Now, once you figure out how to cost recover, then you go, okay, maybe I can make a business out of this and actually charge for something. Because there's only two places you charge. One, you charge the consumer for their broadband connection, $20 to $30 a month. And then the second charge is really on transit. And you manage that at the peering point. You say, okay, you can't peer with me for free, so you got to pay transit, whatever. That's not really, that's other charges, but those are the two big revenue streams, right? And most web service companies do not want to pay for the latter. And one would argue that you're already charging the consumer for broadband access. How is it that you want to charge the web services as well? I mean, you can't collect on both sides. So the argument, that is the argument, but I think the tier ones and the ISPs and the service operators are now trying to think through models where, okay, I'll charge the end consumer, but that never covers the whole cost. So for the guys that really consume a lot, how do I create a different commercial relationship with them? Of course, on the other side, they're absolutely not incented to want to have any relationship, commercial or otherwise, with you. But you've got to think through. And I think what AT&T did recently in the last month, as controversial as it is, where you have sponsored plans, I think that makes a lot of sense. Kind of like, in the voice world where somebody, you charge for a tariff, and there may be an operator, a Kmart, well, that's not a good example, maybe, whoever it is. They may have an 800 number, and the provider actually uses that 800 number to incent people to want to use their service because it's free if you connect with me, right? A LAN's end is an example. And maybe you have the same kind of model with on the backbone, but at some point, the commercial part of that relationship needs to be solved for, because if any which way you look at the traffic patterns and the growth, it is really going to be very challenging.
So, Peter, since you had to step out, let me go to Jack, and then I'll come back to you. Jack, it sounded like half of what Alan was saying was about your business model, or at least companies like yours. Did that ring true to you about the balance of power shifting and about the search for kind of new business models?
Of course, anything balances rings true. I think that this is such an old but new problem. It's kind of interesting to think that something that happened in the FCC in the last 6 months has somehow changed the world. I actually don't think that's the case at all. You can go back in history. You can look at interconnection of railroads. You can look at interconnection of oil and gas, interconnection of wireline telephony, internet interconnection, which we've been dealing with for 25 plus years, and it's a very similar issue. And I think what has changed is there's more concentration of folks who actually serve the consumer. That's certainly the case here in the U.S. as well as abroad. So there are less folks who serve the consumer directly to a home, more folks who serve consumers through wireless technology. So I think that part has changed a little bit. I think Dave's explanation of what technology is available. The technology is great. It works. It's if you want to, depending on what you want to do, you can pretty much do almost anything you need to manage a network today. You can apply QoS. You can apply QoS in an interconnection. You can have all kinds of different queuing. You can do all sorts of very technical things. You can actually do something that's something that is not very technical. You can do nothing, which frankly I think is one of the most new things that's happening in the industry, and that's the idea that if you interconnect and you don't like the other person you interconnect, you just don't do anything. You let the links fill up, And the reason why Dave's getting called by his neighbor is because people are doing nothing, and and not augmenting their interconnection, and not building out the capacity that they need to serve their consumers. In some cases, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's hard. Traffic continues to grow at a pretty healthy rate. As Ballin said, there's a big shift in how consumers actually use their internet connection today. It's to watch TV. Who would have thought 10 years ago even? Thank you, Phil, for making me feel really old, because I was here in 2000 for the first one, so I think I've made almost all of the 14. And just 14 years ago, that was unheard of. Yeah. The idea that you'd actually be able to watch TV at your home over your internet connection was, frankly, unheard of. So in a relatively short period of time, we've seen a great shift in technology, a great shift in capability, a great investment by folks that are building out to the last mile, as well as folks that are building global networks. So I think, I don't think a lot has changed just due to some FCC ruling, except it's pretty clear what the FCC, at least today, can't do. And that may make that do-nothing strategy a little worse.
So Peter, the last question on this, I know better than to ask you what CenturyLink plans to do in response, but what would you expect your competitors to do in the near term? There was this, what appears to maybe be a tempest in a teapot about Verizon, Fios, and Amazon Web Services, and Netflix a couple of weeks ago. I mean, are you expecting to see competitors make aggressive moves in management or in privileging certain types of traffic, or do you think people are still pretty cautious about that?
Fair enough. First of all, apologies to the group here. You'll see me getting up and down a few times. I've hurt my back a few days ago, and sitting is sort of uncomfortable, so I'll be shifting around here.
I'll give you a back row.
That's a deal. And I'm here on a Sunday, so if I say something that I specifically identify with CenturyLink, I'll say so. Okay. Look, in 2009, the FCC came out with some principles around the internet, which I think pretty much everyone, including CenturyLink, can sign up for. Action was taken in 2010. We disagreed with that action. So a piece of that was overruled just a few weeks ago. I don't think things are going to change overnight. And in fact, we'll point out that I personally am not aware of any business practice that changed as a result of the order in 2010. I think whatever we do as an industry, we have to ensure that innovation continues to move forward. And to the comments I think that the other speakers have brought up, that the internet remains a quality experience for all. Canada has a little bit of a different take on net neutrality, and I think they recognize that it may be appropriate in some cases to impact one application, as long as you're open about it, in terms of protecting some other application. But we have to have an open forum really to discuss about what that's going to look like.
So that's great. So just to fill in the audience on my plan, I'm going to give you at least 20 minutes to ask questions of this esteemed panel. But what I think we'll do now, and I've got 6 questions, there's no way we're going to get through all of these. When I frame the issue around the kind of topic for the conference after the internet protocol revolution, and in particular when we talked about the internet and internet protocol being synonymous, Dave said, well, I've got something to say about that, and I've got a slide I can prepare. So why don't we have you just spend a minute or two, and I think this is queued up.
I was going to say, tell me how to turn that on, and we'll see what happens.
There it's ready to go in your animation. With
my animation, okay. So the point I wanted to make, and I'm just going to do one slide, but the point I wanted to make is the internet protocol is not the same as the internet. And a lot of regulation has misunderstood this. A lot of posturing has exploited this confusion, but I think we should really try to be clear about this. If you look at most operators today, most modern operators today, they have built, and I'm using some business school language here, it's the language of platforms. They have built a platform within their firm. They have built an internet protocol-based platform. And that's not the internet. That's just something that belongs to a Liberty Global in a country, or a Verizon, or a Comcast, or a British Telecom. On top of that, they can do a bunch of things, right? And one thing they can do on top of it, of course, assuming that this thing actually does something when I push the buttons, is they can create what's called an autonomous system, which is basically just some routing assertions. And firm number one could do that. And then you make the globally interconnected internet. That's what we all understand today, right? And on top of that, you'd find the web. And on top of that, you might find a Facebook, okay? We all understand this, right? But notice, that's not the only thing you could do with your single firm IP platform. If you do IPTV, if you're delivering television over the internet protocol, it's running over that single firm platform, probably. There's probably no interconnection required. It's probably inside your network. Over the next 10 years, I'm expecting most of the people who deliver television today using the encoding called QAM are going to move to an encoding where it's encoded in IP packets. And does that change the regulatory picture? Does it mean it's on top of the internet? No, it doesn't. Now, what else could you do, of course, in this picture? Well, you could create a separate multi-firm IP network, which is not the internet, but it's an interconnected network of IP, okay? What would you use this for? Well, it's being used today to carry carrier-grade voice over IP. When you make a telephone call, you're using, with a modern provider who has broadband in your home, it's packet-based, it's IP-based. That doesn't mean it's running over the internet, it's running over the internet protocol, and in fact, the interconnections that allow a phone call that originates in one internet-based firm to end up in another may be a different physical interconnection path than the one that's hooking the internet together, okay? So when people talk about, for example, the reliability of tomorrow's phone system, it doesn't necessarily mean they're talking about the same thing as the reliability of the internet, because it could have different interconnection patterns, it could have different provisioning patterns, and so forth. Now, when you have that multi-firm platform, what could you do with it? Well, as I said, today you put voice over IP on top of it, okay? And that makes perfectly good sense. But another thing you could do, looking to the future, would be to say, well, why don't I offer that platform to third-party providers? Why don't I say to Facebook, well, you know, you could get the customers through this path as opposed to that path. Now, the FCC tried to get at this using a construction that they called specialized services, which was a construction which has been around for several things, but its latest incarnation was inside the report and order. But since we're moving beyond that, I think it's helpful to have a picture that sort of says, well, let's not start by assuming the world is the internet and then discovering there are other things called specialized services. Let's try to have a rational picture. So, you know, the obvious point is, if there is an open, non-discriminatory platform over here, especially if that's required by regulation, what that does is create an incentive for people to go over here and say, well, this is not the internet, it's some other platform, so maybe we have possibilities for discrimination which could improve service. I'm not saying that creates harms, it could create benefits. I think it's inappropriate to imagine a regulatory regime which basically causes people to try to achieve regulatory escape by going to alternative platforms unless you understand what the harms are and what's the benefits. So I think if we had a language that contemplated that this was actually the real complexity of the world today, that there are services being offered on top of single firm platforms, television, maybe home monitoring, services that are being offered on top of the internet, services that are being offered on top of IP networks that are hooked together across firms but do not meet the definition of the internet. And we use this picture as a reference. I think we might have conversations that were better grounded in reality. So that's, since the title of the conference was about after the internet protocol revolution, it's all about migration, I just wanted to point out, we're not migrating to the internet, we are migrating to IP-based services. And that's an important distinction.
I think it's a pretty useful slide when you.
I want to keep that up for a while.
When you think about kind of what's happening right now with AWS, more and more enterprises are using AWS or the like. Pick your favorite.
Amazon Web Services.
Yeah, Amazon Web Services, Rackspace, Azure. Pick your favorite way to move your IT shop into the cloud. And what's quickly happening is those businesses, for many different reasons, not necessarily harms, but for many different
Benefits.
reasons, for benefits, are saying, you know what, I don't want that to be over the internet.
Right.
I want to use IP technology, I want to use all the things associated with it, but I want that to be what looks like would be, to my own internal information technology shop, my network. And therefore, we're seeing this left side quickly spring up. Right now, you can go on AWS and connect your enterprise to Amazon. On the right-hand side, you use an IPsec tunnel, you turn it on, it's relatively easy, but quickly, those services will move to the left, and I think that's probably just the beginning. And I agree with your premise that it'd be a shame if the regulatory regime was the thing that pushed you there. Rather, it may just be the benefits and quality of service and other things that you need that push you there.
I mean, and this is kind of a jump ball for anyone, you're focused on the regulatory, both incentives and responses to this kind of separation, but as technologists, do you have separate concerns about fragmentation, interoperability? I mean, is there a virtue to having a unitary public internet atop which all of this flows, or do you not, is that just aesthetics from a technologist point of view?
So, just say, let me comment on this one. So I think it's just absolutely essential that we recognize this point, that an IP network and an internet are two separate things. The goal of the internet is really around openness and broad-based interconnection. The use of IP is for totally different things. Efficiency, it's the way you get networking done. If you look at a company like CenturyLink, and true for others at the table here as well, we have large and rapidly growing businesses around providing others private IP networks today based on MPLS. Marquee banks, financial companies, and so forth. And some will choose to say, I need to be on that type of a network. Others will say, for example, if I want financial quoting, for example, very real time, very relevant, maybe you are getting that over the public internet. So, although I think we need to make sure that the private IP networks stay around as an option, we also have to recognize that public IP cannot be something that is allowed to deteriorate for the argument that we have private IP available.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. So this is actually an amazingly interesting chart that even helps me understand some things better.
Your mic is falling away from you.
Oh, you just turned around.
These engineers never wear ties, and then we have this problem.
Dave wore a tie.
He's an academic, so he has a tie on.
Just kidding.
Academics?
Yeah.
Just let's not go there.
But one of the interesting things that we see now is, I just mentioned the change of the nature of traffic and the patterns and the, variable bit rates, adaptive bit rates. But if you look at, in this chart, the Facebook, right? If I substitute that with Netflix as an example, because it's a lot more content intensive.
That would have made the slide more inflammatory.
Yeah, well, it could be. So take Netflix out, XYZ.
That's cool.
That's video related, something very adaptive bit rate.
Yeah.
The question is, does the concept of the IP networking still stays true, where it was built very much like the telecom network. You have an address, you have a location where something is hosted, and you ping it, you get it, and sometimes you sprinkle that a little bit, but you're really not that incented to sprinkle that a little bit. And that model is really breaking because it's so inefficient because you have multiple people requesting the same information, traversing the same big network, and it's just extremely cost inefficient as well as resource inefficient. So the question becomes, does Facebook or Netflix or XYZ stay up there, or do they stay down in another AS? Because you want everything to be closer and closer to you, so you're not wasting very precious resources in the back. Today, that concept manifests itself in something called CDNs, Content Distributed Networks. Level 3 supports that, Akamai, there's a whole bunch of different people out there. And it's an amazingly efficient way to actually consume and to manage traffic, because then you got all these different load balancers that put traffic in the right place that's more efficient. The challenge for that is it's all very very unique and private and non, it's not interconnected at all. So, and they're driven by different business models for all the right reasons. The question is, in the future, does the CDN network becomes more open, and does that data get sprinkled even more closer to the end user? Then suddenly the cost structure changes, the model changes. Business models like Google and how do you do an index and do a lookup of where data sets changes, lots of things changes. The network changes as well. IP routers are no longer just capturing a packet and then finding the next address and forwarding it on. Routers actually store content. And this model, by the way, it's not an original idea here. I mean, it's been perpetuated by quite a number of different folks. And but it'll take a little while to get there because there's a lot of very powerful business interests that would not want to see something like this succeed. But I think, you know, your chart here, I think, begs the question, yeah, great to the left, but really more to the bottom.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
And of course, conditions of innovation are one thing that we debate about the left and the right and the top and the bottom as well. So I'm going to sneak in one more question under the wire before turning to the audience. It's near and dear to my heart because this is kind of the focus of a lot of my research. So in the last year, we have learned from Edward Snowden that the NSA is undertaking an extensive operation of surveillance at the infrastructural layer of some of the major players in the world. So put aside the subpoena debate in Section 702 and 215 of FISA and things like this. What I want to know about is how this is going to change the incentives and the kind of technological investments and innovation for infrastructural players, right? I mean, are companies responding? Should they be responding? How have relationships between industry and government been impacted? Again, I'm going to start with you, Balin, maybe because you've got more of the global viewpoint, and an interesting part of the debate is them versus us. What do we think we should expect in the next year from the NSA revelations?
I think, so now if I put on the hat where we actually own big networks, in Europe, it certainly didn't help American companies. We're an American investor. We're based in Denver, Colorado. We own networks all across Europe and bits of Asia, and we do a lot of M&A transactions. And governments and regulators are freaked out, and they're freaked out not so much because of what they know. It's more about what they don't know. And unfortunately, for operators, most of this is really transparent to most operators. And there are small groups within companies like ours that interface with the government, and we try to help the government as much as we can to the end where it makes sense. But at the end of the day, we are not active participants in this whole, what happened with the NSA, et cetera. And and when people think that operators are really knowledgeable and are really helping the government or one way or the other, it's just giving too much credit, really, because most of us want to help the government, but we really don't regulate the government. It works the other way around. And now, given what Snowden did, I think what he did, forget the rules that he violated, et cetera, I think he did a lot of great service to humankind by exposing what he did, because not because it caused security problems, et cetera, but it raised the level of the conversation, and it certainly put a lot of thoughts into operators, into consumers, into governments, into various agencies that I tell you that discussion and debate would never have happened 18 months ago.
And Peter, you of course come to CenturyLink from Quest, where Quest has been engaged in this debate for longer than most of the companies represented at the table. So what are your thoughts on what the last year's news has brought to the debate?
Well, so I'll mention two things. First, in terms of inside this country, I think a lot of end users are nervous. They don't know what's going on. And I think for their benefit, we need clarity. We need to tell them what's being done and under what terms can it be done. I think most people are aware that there are avenues for CALEA, lawfully authorized electronic surveillance for voice calls and for internet communications to the extent that it's not encrypted. If it's encrypted, law enforcement has other avenues it's allowed to pursue, and that ought to be made clear. So I think in this country, the important thing is to get clarity about what we do, how we do it. But I want to touch on a point that Balin made, which I think is very important. CenturyLink, like Level 3 and others, does business as a U.S. company outside of this country. And it's sort of fairly ironic that coming off of concerns voiced by some that, Huawei and ZTE should not have equipment in this country because of the concerns of backdoors, I think we as American companies now face the same concern abroad as to whether our infrastructure is safe for the citizens and the governments around the world to use. It's become a real issue for us.
So Jack, for me, the most chilling thing I've seen in the Snowden release is it almost looks like a Post-it, the yellow PowerPoint slide that shows, I think, Google and Yahoo over here communicating probably via SMTP or something. And then there's a little arrow in between at the fat pipe with a smiley face, literally a smiley face, that says no SSL here. That might be a pipe you guys run. What is a big tier 1 company doing to respond to something like this? Is this mostly for the endpoints and more encryption around, or is there something that tier 1s are thinking or doing in response to this as well?
So Alan and Peter started with their safe harbor comments at the beginning of the talk here. I brought our general counsel, so first off, I think that the increase in the discussion is good. And I think transparency, to the extent that that's possible, is important. As an operator, I think that, and we operate a large network here in the U.S. as well as on a couple other continents. So we operate in many, many countries. And as an operator, we don't have an option. We have to comply to local law, period. And that's a really important thing for folks to realize, that as if we operate in one country, we have to comply to those local laws, and that's something we sign up to as an operator, as we all do. What do tier 1 companies do? They transmit data back and forth between their customers and comply to local law. What do endpoints do? What technology is available? I think that we will see more enterprises use things like encryption. I think that that's inevitable. I think that as part of all this, that sort of forced the hand of many folks. I can't help but to think that the whole Snowden thing is a positive in many ways, and I think that raising the debate is a positive. That being said, we all have to operate in the world we live, and that's kind of one of the things we have to do.
So Dave, I want you to respond, but can I add one gloss, and you can choose to ignore it if you want, which is I'm interested, especially from your vantage point, of how a technologist views what the NSA has chosen to do and how they've chosen to do it, particularly on the kind of infiltration, vulnerability, weakening systems side of things. Bruce Schneier has been quoted as saying, this is a violation of the social contract. Like, it goes to the fabric of kind of democratic rule and the way we relate to our government. Do you feel that way? Is this deeply offensive to you as a technologist?
Well, what I was going to say was, because you started out by asking me about the sort of the art of the technical possible.
Yeah.
If you look at what Snowden has done, and again, one of the people that's really looked at this is Bruce Schneier, and he's a good place to turn for this stuff. Yeah. What's really important to understand is the number of different technical means they used and the number of different authorities under which they did that. And if you talk to the NSA compliance officer, they go through arguments that are as complex as the legal argument about authority in the Open Internet Report and Order, which is to say, well, can we do this under this paragraph? Can we do this under this paragraph? But the range of methods that they have used is very broad. It's not just tapping a fiber. It's all kinds of stuff. Some of the things they have done strike me as, well, You didn't think they were doing that? Some of the things that they have done I find deeply corrosive if they've actually done them. Weakening encryption, getting people to distribute code that has a bad random number generator so it reduces the work factor to break the stuff. You know, to the extent they're playing games like that, they're causing deep harm, because the point is you shouldn't assume, you should assume that there are only a small number of organizations in the world that are smart enough to figure out what they did, but you should not assume that NSA is the only one.
Right.
And in the end, we all benefit from a more secure environment. And so, you know, issues of the law of the land, that's fine, but I don't believe you should go around deliberately weakening things. And now there is this other issue. Should we be worried about backdoors in boxes? And, you know, all of these boxes have so many vulnerabilities in them that, you know, somebody once said to me, could we go audit, but particularly about Huawei, could we go read their code and see whether it has a backdoor in it? I said, what an insane suggestion, because you're going to read the code as backdoor inserted. No. It's just a vulnerability that you know more about than somebody else. And to find it, you're looking for vulnerabilities. And of course, these days, what do you do if you find a vulnerability? You sell it on the zero-day vulnerability on the open market, right? So
to the NSA, most likely, right?
Well, NSA's a buyer, yeah, sure. So, you know, we should be trying to build more secure worlds. And I get offended when I find that people are actually deliberately weakening security. But in some sense, I think, you know, this is sort of like, it sort of feels like Casablanca, you know. There's gambling going, you know what, you know.
So the tradition at Silicon Flatirons is the first question should be asked by a student on every panel. There's a lot of technical knowledge that's been flowing around, but it's a wonderful opportunity to ask this group. And I know some of your names, and I'm a law professor, so I'm not afraid to call on you. Yes, thank you. There's a microphone because we've got a webcast, so please wait for that.
Hi, my name is Bill Gillespie. I have a question for the panel in general. David and Peter have kind of touched on this, but how plausible do you think it is that other governments are engaged in similar style surveillance mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, part of the question is, right, so the ITIF says, $35 billion in lost productivity as companies move their data offshore, which of course assumes that offshore it's any better, any safer. Now, there probably isn't a government in the world with the budget of ours for this type of activity. But is this just going to happen everywhere? I mean, it's hopeless to avoid?
You should assume it's happening everywhere.
I mean, the Russians, right, just recently released this tape-recorded conversation, probably not too high technology, but you should just assume that all countries are. And are they all equally successful?
No.
No.
They're not equally sophisticated either.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're really good at it.
Right.
We've been in the business a long time.
But they all want to be.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, espionage is an ancient tradition, you know, and so when you think about the issue is, you know, it used to be that we spied on the Brits and they spied on us, and that's the way we complied to the law, you know. It was sort of a mutual deal. Now we're just spying on ourselves, you know, but separate the legal framework and the argument about ethics. All countries want intelligence. They want to gather intelligence. And all countries are worried about terrorism, and that's called all countries to turn in. You know, for every country, the great Satan is no longer over there. It's somehow inside. And that's just the way it is.
I would add here that it's not just an assumption that you have to make about governments. You have to make an assumption about entities such as organized crime all over the world as well. Look at the Target breach recently. We have to worry about vulnerabilities. We have to figure out how to protect those. Paul, you touched on the issue of data in other countries. I mean, there are rules that you have to comply with in terms of which countries you can put data in. And you also have to think, if you put data in a country, might that data be more vulnerable to attack, which could have implications back in this country or other third-party entities?
We process about 85 terabytes of security event data a day, and the number one source is nation state, and that's the number one. Number two is organized crime, And that's just the fact of life that we deal with every day, operating a big global network. And those nation states, that's other nations, right? And we see it every day. And that's where we focus our attention. So it's not just on this particular issue, it's a broader security issue for us, as Peter said.
I mean, let me ask a follow-up that you may not want to answer. The president, in talking about this a few weeks ago, tried to draw an equivalency between what industry was doing and what the NSA was doing. And, you know, it's not just us who's taking your data. All of these companies are taking your data as well. I'm not sure if the point was, and we're all evil, or we're all good, or we're all neutral. But what do we make of that? I mean, is part of the blame or part of the solution business models? And I recognize that we're really talking about things higher up the stack usually, so it's even easier for you to answer because you're not talking about your own companies. Is part of the problem Facebook at the top, or Twitter, or Foursquare, or these other things, and that kind of the change needs to begin there? Or is that not, I mean, do you not subscribe to that view?
I don't subscribe to that view. I think that, you know, from the vulnerability side, I think that more and more as you put more and more apps on your phone, as you put more and more apps on your tablet, as you use more software in the cloud, you have a chance to be more vulnerable. And that's really where I think those companies perhaps add to the issue. I don't think it's anything more than that. But you know, it's an ever-growing issue. Right. An attack on the internet just a year ago, a big attack was maybe in the tens of gigs. Now it's in the hundreds. Yeah. And there's no end in sight.
Okay, so now we'll go outside students. Are there any other questions? Barbara? Again, please wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Barbara Fanchevik, and I wanted to follow up on the roles of the IP platform. I love your slide. As you can imagine. And the one area I want to push you on is sort of implicitly everybody on the panel was assuming that the global interconnected internet would not offer quality of service, and that might produce a very strong incentive for companies to move their services on the multi-firm IP network. And I mean, when we were thinking about what the open internet order should look like, we put a lot of thought into preventing exactly that sort of trajectory, because the idea was clearly you want the open internet to evolve as well. And for all the reasons that we want an open internet, like easy access for innovators, you would want this open internet to be an infrastructure that offers these kinds of sort of positive services, maybe different types of quality of service. And, you know, for those who've read the Open Internet Order, it actually allowed certain forms of quality of service, those where the end user chooses which type of service it wants to use and for which applications. And so I want to push you on, you know, is this just an implicit assumption that the multi-firm IP network will be so much better? Shouldn't we be working on making sure that the open global internet also evolves in a good way? And then clearly regulation would play a role in that.
It's interesting that when you say if the multi-firm internet becomes big enough, it's the internet. Right. So we shouldn't kid ourselves there. The internet itself, you know, does offer a high level of quality today. I can go and watch a HD video on my TV at home over the internet. So I would argue that it does offer a high level of quality. It's the question of whether the multi-firm IP network has a different set of characteristics versus the open internet. And I think that the market says, yeah. I mean, we used to call them frame relay and ATM networks many years ago. It's just that today they're starting to converge on technology, largely because the market argues that you know, using a common technology base is the most economic way of building out technology. And that I didn't mean to.
Barbara, wait for the microphone again.
So I feel you are evading my question in that I wasn't using the term quality of service in the term of, oh, do we have a high quality of the network? I was using it in the very specific way in that some companies say, we need low reliability. We need a certain guaranteed bandwidth. And so the open internet order tried to make that kind of service possible in the open internet so that whoever has a great idea that needs or would benefit from that kind of service in the network could take advantage of it without engaging in negotiations and maybe paying the network provider. And so that's the kind of area that I wanted to ask about.
Could I perhaps add?
And this will be our last round of answers on this panel.
I think so. What I heard there was a statement that if we had quality of service paradigms within the public internet, would it be necessary to have layers of private IP networks? And it's interesting from my perspective, the origin of a private IP network was not driven by quality of service. It was driven by security. And if you look at the types of people that are using private IP networks, they're concerned about, the discussion we had sort of 10 minutes ago, which is how can I be absolutely certain that there's no backdoor that can be accessed by someone else? And in this case, if I'm saying it's only my enterprise that's connected, it's an easier problem to attack. It's not perfect, but it's easier.
So I would slightly disagree with that, in the sense that at least some of the marketing around carrier-grade VoIP, and this comes and goes in the advertising marketing, but some of the marketing around carrier-grade VoIP was that it would work better than internet-based alternatives like Vonage, and that the carriers could engineer that private network to a level of performance. Basically, since it's only one app, you just adequately provision it and then you go on. But the argument that by partitioning it from the internet, it would work better actually showed up in some marketing. So I think there are some edge conditions here. I don't see it, and I think this is our conversation and we're supposed to stop, but I don't see it as inevitable. I think there's actually a positive spin on the current situation, which in fact it would allow operators to experiment with modes of enhancing applications. And I'm not saying that that's through quality of service. I'm just saying operators have the opportunity to see whether they can do a better job of supporting applications on the open internet and whether that's technically feasible and whether it's in their business interest. But I think we should, I personally would prefer to see the open internet good enough, and that's a completely undefined term, but I could try to define it, but I won't because we're out of time, that most innovation can take root and be happy on the open internet.
So let's end there. That's a moderately optimistic note to end on. Maybe a completely optimistic note to end on. So please join me in thanking the panel once again for a wonderful conversation. So although Phil has bragged about our ability to give you breaks, this is not one of them. This is a moment for you to kind of stretch your arms a little bit, stretch your legs a little bit. Please keep your seats, and Larry Strickling will join us for our opening keynote.
So, as promised, you will have a break shortly, but before the break, we do want to offer